Good afternoon, everybody. I am Lekhansh. I am doing my postdoctoral fellowship here. As usual, I have less time and I'll be as relevant as possible. Uh, this is the usual disclaimer which runs always. You can reproduce these slides acknowledging Nimans Echo. For any modifications, you can contact us. My overview of presentation will be, first I'll be going a little bit into the historical context. We have been searching, I mean, humanity, its relationship with sedatives has been a love-hate relationship for a long time. So we'll try to spice it up a little bit and have a longitudinal look at it. Then I'll be talking about the basic psychopharmacology of benzodiazepines per se, subtypes of benzodiazepine abuse, misuse, dependence, addiction, whichever term you want to use, because none of them are clear, determinants of abuse, evaluation and conceptualizing the case, and then management. So I'll give you a okay. So I have taken some from the archives. I have taken how we have progressed from one sedative to another. Okay.
Just to check, are all of you able to see the slides? Are all of you able to see the slides? It's coming?
Okay. So in early 1900s, we came up with barbiturates, and this was one of the ads which came in newspapers and was circulated amongst. Okay, I am too distracted. I'll take 2 minutes. We are done now. Okay, fine. Right. So this was the barbiturate era. This was the ad which was there. When you prescribe barbiturates, you prescribe sleep. Quite ironically, Marilyn Monroe gave this quote exactly 2 months prior to actually overdosing on barbiturates. So why did benzodiazepines come into existence was the therapeutic ratio of barbiturates was very low. Therapeutic ratio is what we calculate, which is the 50% therapeutic dose, a dose which will work for 50% of the population, compared to LD50, that is lethal dose for 50% of the population. That way, benzodiazepines appeared to be a boon. I mean, they were a big discovery. Fine. In between came another drug. I am not sure if the compound name is visible. And this is meprobamate. So again, it came and it was said for the nervous people, it is going to give a good relief. Its therapeutic ratio was somewhat better. Recently, European Union has suspended its circulation and production altogether. One of the problems with this drug was, of course, it was habit forming. The other, it was again very popular in Hollywood, but then that's not a problem. One problem was that it had an interaction with NSAIDs and caused acute cerebral edema. One of the conspiracy theories says that Bruce Lee probably died because of taking both these compounds together. 1960s onwards, we know this. I mean, if you read that ad, it could have been an ad for anything, but then it is for Xanax. So relax, lady, leave your home housework and things like that. The funny part is a lot of patients who come to us actually report improvement in these symptoms. Alprazolam probably has some antidepressant effects which are being studied. You can read the package insert which was circulated amongst physicians for Librium, that your patients will become more accessible and communicative. So this was the 1960 era, benzodiazepines, safer drugs in the market, everybody very happy about them. Almost 30 years from then, it was realized, from the time they were introduced from 1980s onwards, there were some skeptics who were saying these are not as safe as the pharma industry is telling us they are. Finally, this report came, which was an APA task force, and the report clearly said that they have definite dependence causing and addictive potential, and these risks should be discussed with patients on long-term benzodiazepine treatment. Now, I am coming to the current era. Now we have something called safe sleep medications, the Z drugs. When they were launched in the last edition of Goodman Gilman, it was written, they have no chemical similarity with benzodiazepines. They have a novel mechanism of action. There is no change in sleep architecture, no tolerance, no rebound insomnia, and therefore no abuse liability as well. Did not materialize to be so. Lowenson and Ruiz were skeptic from the beginning itself, and they said that while zolpidem does not have the similar molecular configuration, it has all the other features which it shares with benzodiazepine. Its effects can be blocked by flumazenil, which is a specific benzodiazepine antagonist. It shows cross tolerance with benzodiazepines. This is a recent, it's a big study which has come up. It's a pharmacovigilance study. And after this study, at least in European Union, package insert has included that it has significant abuse potential. Zolpidem is a funny drug. I'm sure a lot of us are using it. I mean, I would say it's a drug which we know very little about, but are very comfortable about as well. It is being used in catatonia. It has a definite potential of inducing acute psychotic reaction. It is being used in high dose in movement disorders with excellent results. And what is the most interesting part of this drug is when it is given in high doses, it's a psychostimulant. So when people were given in 4 to 5 times the therapeutic dose for movement disorder, what they reported was an activation, increased feelings of euphoria, increased feelings of socialization. So zolpidem, although we are using it, there is much to it which will come to us eventually. So this whole historical exercise was just to put it in context that we daily struggle with should we prescribe benzodiazepines or not. We are not the only one doing it. Since 1950s or perhaps eternity, we are struggling with this question. Coming to basic pharmacology, coming to pharmacokinetics, this is a chart which is it is available in Goodman-Gilman as well. It is available online as well. It talks about the half-lives of the molecules. Why it is important is there is one theory which says that compounds which have short half-life probably have more abuse potential. The interesting part is these are blood half-lives. The action or you can say the peak dose effects depend very highly on the lipophilic nature of the drug. So you will see here that alprazolam is actually, you cannot call it a short acting. It is probably in the mid of it. But then still the effects are almost immediate, and the effects last for a very small time because there are 2 distribution phases. In the first distribution phase, highly perfused organs like brain get the delivery of the drug. In the second distribution phase, the drug partitions itself in the fat cells and the blood levels come down. I will not go into details of it. I think we have a separate module on the basic neurosciences of addiction. What's important is that we still don't know how many kinds of GABA receptors are there. 19 are already cloned. From permutation combination of this, it's a pentameric molecule. You have alpha, beta, and gamma subunits. You can have much more combinations than what we know as of now. What has been shown in animal studies quite conclusively is that alpha-1 is responsible for the sedation, amnesia, ataxia, and anti-seizure effect, and perhaps for habit-forming effects as well. Alpha-2 and alpha-3 are anti-anxiety and more of a muscle relaxant. And alpha-5, which mostly localizes to hippocampus, has a very low sensitivity generally to benzodiazepines, but it does get affected and it is involved in memory and cognition. We need to know this for the reason that some benzodiazepines are better anti-anxiety, better anti-seizure like clonazepam, might not be that excellent sedatives or hypnotics, while some drugs are very good sedatives and hypnotics, might not be so good anti-seizure drugs. The basic mechanism of action is allosteric modulation. Once benzodiazepine attaches to this pentameric molecule, when GABA comes there, the chloride current which flows is almost double of what it would have been had benzodiazepine been not there. Why benzodiazepines are safer is they do not mimic GABA. They need GABA to exert their action, while barbiturates, meprobamate, chloral hydrate, and alcohol perhaps can directly mimic the actions of GABA. Whenever I try to understand why somebody would get euphoria, at least with alprazolam, nitrazepam, and flunitrazepam, very well reported that patients have a feeling of euphoria. The whole idea is that interneurons have more of GABA receptors. Interneurons are inhibiting the dopaminergic neurons. When you take benzodiazepines, these interneurons get excessively inhibited and there is a loss of inhibition. So one can call it inhibition of inhibition or disinhibition. And therefore, there is a definite dopamine release, and these molecules do give pleasure and they are reinforcing. Coming to neuroadaptation, which is seen, one of the recent ways of classifying it is within system neuroadaptation and between system neuroadaptations. Within system neuroadaptation is decreased coupling, that is benzodiazepine and their receptors, there is decreased coupling of it. One the major changes which happen and are well proven in vitro studies, I have highlighted them: internalization of receptors and increased L-type calcium channels. Now, this is important from an academic point of view because there are studies in mice. When they gave nimodipine, these mice did not develop tolerance to the effects. And perhaps this gives us a rationale for using drugs like pregabalin and gabapentin, which are specific calcium channel inhibitors, not blockers per se. One can conceptualize it that you're loading your brain with excess of depressants and it is trying to increase its excitability to counter that. So there are increased AMPA receptors and there is increased tonic glutamate release. Finally, you have a CNS hyperexcitable state. Coming to subtypes, I think subtyping in benzodiazepine is much more important and relevant than I would like to say in any other substance use disorder. Why? Because this is a slightly busy slide, as Dr. Deepak puts it. I mean, one way of conceptualizing it could be in European countries where you cannot get benzodiazepines over the counter. That is the caveat to this whole idea. Is the patient currently prescribed benzodiazepine? Yes, he is. Is he taking as per prescription? Yes, he is. Then when you are trying to taper it, does he develop any physical or psychological withdrawal? That can happen. I will put it in my last slide. I have put almost 25% of people on therapeutic dose without any dose escalation when treated for a long time develop some withdrawal symptoms when you try to taper the benzodiazepine. That is a completely different class of people and that can be called therapeutic dose dependent. You follow the same stem. Are they taking as per prescription? No, that is either they are continuing their prescription after the doctor has discontinued or they are taking it in increased quantities. This comes under a group which can be called quasi-therapeutic dose abuse. It is generally low dose abuse, less than 40 mg of diazepam equivalents per day. You are more likely to find comorbid anxiety or depression in this group. They are of slightly higher age group and they have internalizing symptoms and the internalizing traits, temperamental traits. Coming to the other stem of this classification, he is not being prescribed benzodiazepine currently. One should ask, was he prescribed in the past? That is, he is continuing his prescription. You again come to quasi-therapeutic dose abuse. So coming to the cases which we discussed, the first case would perhaps fall somewhere in quasi-therapeutic dose abuse, although his levels went pretty high, so you cannot put them in any of these. The second case will certainly go into intentional abuse. It's a high dose abuse. There are comorbid substance use disorders. The sourcing, I mean, this is taken from Western literature, so street sourcing is the word. They take downers and uppers and things like that. They generally use multiple preparations of benzodiazepines and they have externalizing traits. Coming to determinants of abuse, I mean, what decides that a person will get addicted to it? We can classify it into agent-related factors and patient-related factors. Unlike what we would like to believe, agent-related factors are not conclusively settled. In studies which were done on addicts who were addicted to some other substances and they were given different benzodiazepines, they volunteered and they rated the euphorogenic effects. Flunitrazepam was the highest, nitrazepam followed it, and alprazolam followed that. After that, all agents were almost similar. Half-life effect I have already discussed. It might be more affected by the availability of the drug, the fashion which is there as of that time when somebody gets addicted to it, and the prescription patterns, because ultimately what is in circulation is what is being written by the doctors. Patient-related factors are certainly presence of other substance use disorders is a risk factor for problematic benzodiazepine use, untreated psychiatric disorders, high amount of neuroticism, chronic pain conditions. This point comes mainly from studies in elderly patients, and insomnia certainly. Okay. This is some data which we are as of now in the process of writing up for a very long time actually. These are the benzodiazepine dependent patients, ICD-10 diagnosis of benzodiazepine dependence, patients who were inpatients only, and the N number is 170. We have seen them in last 7 years. At least we do get what is the classical teaching. The majority, almost 80% of cases can be explained by alprazolam and nitrazepam. An unlikely suspect here is zolpidem. As I was saying, its abuse potential is yet to be realized. It has significant abuse potential, at least in our population. When we did this, we found that. coming to comorbidity, as I was talking of patient-related factors, you will see that I think the font is too small for anybody to see, but it's visible. Okay. We could not hold a valid comparison between the groups who were not using any other substance, that is pure benzodiazepine dependence, because most of the patients that we had in inpatients were polysubstance. Now, it can as well be an artifact because we are sitting in a tertiary center. The moment we hear in the OPD that, oh, you are using opioids and benzodiazepine both, we say you probably get in, that's a safer way to treat you. So it can as well be an artifact of it. Coming to evaluation and conceptualizing the case, the most important part is, I mean, in general practice at least, one has to be aware of the abuse liability of these agents. Vulnerable groups are patients who are already having a substance use disorder, and there are reasons for it. I mean, alcoholics use it to tread over their withdrawal symptoms. There is a high comorbidity of patients who are being maintained on methadone and or buprenorphine, or who are using other opioids. They like to take benzodiazepines because some of the side effects of opioids can be countered by this. Patients who are taking stimulants, as they say, uppers and downers, when they want to balance their rush, they take benzodiazepines along with it. So certainly substance use disorder is a primary thing. Having an anxiety or depressive disorder or symptoms, I mean, even symptoms would predispose a person to continue taking benzodiazepines, because relief in itself can be conceptualized as a pleasure. Having insomnia and going through significant life stressors. Short-acting agents, immediate release preparations of alprazolam or nitrazepam probably could be more addictive, probably would require more dose escalation as compared to long-acting agents. It's all probable. There is no significant literature to say it is like that. If a patient requests for continuation while you are trying to push for discontinuation because you have stabilized him on any other agent, or if he asks for rescue prescriptions, give me 10 more tablets, I might require it in this week, I'm going through a rough phase, things like that. All patients on a sedative for more than 4 weeks. This is what Maudsley says, that you should not prescribe sedatives for more than, Maudsley guidelines say that you should not be prescribing sedatives for more than 4 weeks at a time. Point of care testing for opioid addicts. If you are treating opioid addicts, it would be a good idea to actually test them for benzodiazepine as well. Conceptualization is the same. We have already discussed it. It will help you to actually predict the outcome. It will help you in deciding how will you manage this case, because the outcome of intentional abuse is certainly poorer than quasi-therapeutic dose or therapeutic dose dependence. I will discuss it in the interventions. Now, I have put these symptoms here because patients will eventually have some symptoms once, okay, they have agreed to taper the dose and they come up with some symptoms. Those symptoms can be conceptualized as, and these are concepts, they are majorly overlapping and very difficult to delineate from each other. They can be conceptualized as rebound symptoms, which are original complaints but with higher intensity. Somebody had insomnia, was started on a sleeping pill, now you're trying to stop that sleeping pill, his insomnia has worsened. They generally appear at the end of dose tapering and persist till they are treated, because they are symptoms in their own right, and they might not meet diagnostic criterion for a diagnosable psychiatric disorder. Withdrawal symptoms, some of the symptoms are quite specific for benzodiazepine withdrawal, like sensory symptoms, that is increased sensitivity to light, tinnitus, increased sensitivity to sound, paresthesia, shock-like sensations, tremors, myoclonic jerks, and muscle cramps. They appear in the initial period and then they reappear when you are taking away the last portion of your benzodiazepine substitution. They eventually decrease with time. At least the literature that I read, most of them seem to be quite confident that they disappear within 2 weeks. Some of them then add a caveat that there are case reports of protracted abstinence syndrome as well. There is a high amount of psychological symptoms during withdrawal, and this manifests as drug seeking. So your patients might come to you with multiple physical complaints, asking for going back to an earlier dose, which is again a sign that it's a withdrawal syndrome. And then recurrence of symptoms. Patient had earlier an anxiety disorder. He was being treated with benzodiazepines. You are taking away benzodiazepines and he is again manifesting a diagnosable psychiatric condition. As I said, there's a major overlap, and actually the only way to distinguish is once you discontinue and you observe for some period of time. But then that does not mean that you should not be treating, because if you don't treat and patient is distressed, eventually he is going to go back to his earlier pattern of use. High dose abusers undergoing rapid discontinuation being defined as less than 2 weeks. That's how Ashton has described it. May have seizures, delirium, and hyperthermia. It can be a life-threatening situation. Timing of withdrawal symptoms majorly depend on the half-life of the agent which was being used. We have already discussed these scales, CIVA-B and benzodiazepine withdrawal symptom questionnaire. They might be worthwhile because you will eventually find yourself struggling with the question that is patient just seeking more medicines or is he actually having withdrawal? So having an objective assessment is always going to help you. Coming to management and the evidence for it, management can be divided in minimal intervention programs. That is the funny part of it. The two cases that we discussed, we get a sense as if benzodiazepine dependence is a very severe, difficult to treat illness. But if you give a PubMed search, you will find that there are studies which say a phone call from the general physician telling the patient to decrease his dose is as effective as anything else. So you feel bewildered with it. If a phone call can treat it, perhaps, I mean, anything might have treated it. Newspaper ad might as well do it. So minimal intervention programs and systematic discontinuation programs. Systematic discontinuation programs are further divided into gradual dose reduction. Nothing else is added to it. Or other group could be gradual dose reduction plus pharmaco or psychotherapy. The caveat to all this evidence is it is for chronic therapeutic or quasi-therapeutic dependence. Because when they do studies, they exclude polydrug abusers. So the kind of patients that we sit here and see, we actually don't have an evidence base to say what will be best for them. Minimal intervention programs I already spoke to you. Sending a letter to patients using benzodiazepine for more than 3 months, giving an information booklet, a single session of counseling. When I went through, this is a meta-analysis, when I went through the study characteristics, they were generally elderly in nursing homes. Average use was 5 years at the same dose. So dose escalation was not there. There were minimal psychiatric or substance use comorbidities. What the meta-analysis says is odds ratio is 2 to 4 times. That is, they are 2 to 4 times more likely to stop as compared to if you had not intervened. Coming to gradual dose reduction, we have already discussed this management in both these cases. You convert to a long-acting preparation, and the point is you stabilize the patient on that preparation for some period. Because you are exposing him to a new drug, he will be anxious about it. He hasn't used diazepam earlier. He was using 200 tablets of alprazolam. Now you're giving him some 10, 13 tablets of diazepam. So you have to demonstrate that this will control your craving and your withdrawal symptoms. And then you attempt to taper. It can be done as an outpatient, except in some cases. Now the next slide is going to obfuscate the whole scene, because the optimal speed of reduction, I will tell you what it has been. This is the conversion chart which you can use tentatively, but you will realize that when patients are using very high doses, you'll end up in doses which are double of LD50, lethal dose 50 for diazepam. They go in grams together. So it's not a simple calculation. You might actually have to do it in a patient-tailored way. So the question is how slow and how long. So these are different studies which I have quoted. The first study did 25% reduction per week and got a 63% success rate. Another study did 10 to 25% reduction fortnightly. So this is just the half of the speed of reduction and got a lesser success rate actually, which is counterintuitive if we think that way. Another study which Ashton did was a patient-tailored, he extending up to 15 months, continuing care at a tertiary center on an outpatient basis, of course not as an inpatient, and he got a success rate in excess of 80%. I forgot to mention it here. Then there's a very interesting study in 1987 where he had analyzed 48 patients, Sanchez-Grace, and he found that abrupt discontinuation compared with fixed dose reduction, there was no difference in the final rate. I have not put this slide to intentionally obfuscate. I just want to communicate that this is not settled yet. However, most guidelines and reviews say that both high drug users and low drug users can be detoxed within 4 to 8 weeks. Coming to the second part of systematic treatment, additional pharmacotherapy. This is a table which is given in Lovinson and Ruiz. It's quite useful. We would like to concentrate on values in which the confidence interval is not crossing 0, because if it's crossing 0, it's as good as nothing. What you get is anticonvulsants certainly work. This good N number, there are good number of studies. Valproate perhaps better than carbamazepine. What does not work is giving things like buspirone. Progesterone, I don't know if we use it at all. Then what doesn't, what you can look at propranolol, it also does not seem to be very effective. The confidence interval is from 0.3 to 1, so it's actually crossing 0. You might actually get no benefit. Some of the newer drugs are not included in this meta-analysis, so I'll be talking of that as well. Antidepressants do seem to work. You can see the highest odds ratio is for trazodone, perhaps because it has a sedative action. Again, paroxetine has a sedative action. So one might as well say, why not give TCAs? The problem is patients who are anxious do not tolerate TCAs very well because they cause tachycardia, dryness of mouth in their own right. Coming to newer treatment options, these are all evidence-based, perhaps grade D. These are case series, most of them retrospective. We used baclofen in 7 patients who were polydrug users. And what baclofen helped us with was we could bring down the dose of diazepam at a faster rate. Quetiapine has been used for treatment of withdrawal symptoms. One interesting thing which is being coming now is low dose subcutaneous or continuous IV infusion of flumazenil. What they are saying is flumazenil, because it's an antagonist, perhaps it reverses the neuroadaptation. It might as well have some intrinsic benzodiazepine-like activity, therefore it can reduce the withdrawal symptoms also. This study is a recent study, but you can find a study done in 1987. One doesn't understand why flumazenil was on the shelf and not studied from 1987 to 2014. Now there are animal studies going of implants of flumazenil. The problem with flumazenil is oral preparations are not there. So they are doing it in sheep transplants and they are seeing the tolerability of it. This is an interesting study. Why I should not be quoting it here is these patients were diagnosed with generalized anxiety disorder. They were on benzodiazepines. I'm talking of the last study by Headley et al. 2014, pregabalin. So they were diagnosed with generalized anxiety disorders. They were on SSRIs and benzodiazepines and were not able to stop benzodiazepines. And therefore pregabalin was substituted. Now we know pregabalin does work for anxiety. It's one of the approved drugs. But it gives us a hint that if anxiety is the main thing, temperament, trait or state, perhaps pregabalin could be a good choice to give on a long-term basis. Determinants of outcome, this is also slightly counterintuitive. What these studies say is 2 out of 3 patients will successfully discontinue usage with systematic discontinuation. Looks very bright, but I again want to say this is therapeutic dose dependence or quasi-therapeutic dose dependence. This is not high dose dependence because there are very minimal studies on that. And 50% of those who actually discontinue will remain abstinent at 1 year. The predictors of a good risk of a good outcome are: the best predictor is the dose which the patient was taking, then number of preparations, absence of other substance use disorders, and absence of personality traits of neuroticism, dependency, and anancasm. Somehow there was no correlation between duration of abuse and stage of change as seen by your motivational background. So this is my final slide. Because most of us do prescribe benzodiazepine, I don't want to scare you with it. Pharmacoepidemiological studies say only 1 to 2% users will escalate their dose above 40 mg per day in next 2 years. Only 15 to 25% will have, not only, it's actually a significant percentage, will have withdrawal if treated for a year at therapeutic dose. Now this is a significant thing. And this was a study done by Crook. He had done a survey all over the world and he found that physicians seem to love benzodiazepines because they are rapid acting and they are very effective medications. I mean, there's no need to be very scared of them, but they do have abuse liability. Thanks.
Thank you, Rekhansh. I think we've come to the point where you can start taking questions. I'm going to stop the share for now, but please feel free to now ask your questions or send them in via chat. Yeah.
Would you like to suggest how much should be the dosage of one of your other work which looked at the dosages which has been used?
Yes, when we tried to correlate the reported use converted into diazepam equivalents and the dose required, the maximum dose of diazepam required in ward, on day 1 for detox to control withdrawal symptoms, we found somehow the dose required in the ward was almost 1/3 of what we could have predicted. There could be multiple reasons for it. One of the reasons could be that people who use benzodiazepines are very anxious because the withdrawal is subjectively very troublesome. They might over-report their usage because they are afraid that if they under-report, you'll give them very little medication and they'll have a terrible withdrawal. That is one possibility. The other possibility is, although we do convert it in diazepam equivalents, diazepam is a completely different molecule. Nordiazepam is a completely different molecule, while alprazolam, zolpidem are different molecules. So probably nordiazepam has more intrinsic efficacy at the receptor site, and therefore lower doses are required. Third thing is, a lot of these people have cognitive issues. They are under the influence for the better part of their days. They might not be able to give you an accurate number of tablets which they have been taking. So what we found in our review, and it was a sufficiently powered review, was generally it's the 1/3 of dose which you would predict from their reported usage.
Just to add to that, some of the IPS guidelines, funnily enough, about benzodiazepine dependence actually say that you don't need more than 30 mg of diazepam to prevent seizures. So one of the interesting things with the diazepam molecule is that perhaps the dose required to prevent severe symptoms of withdrawal, which is what actually concerns the clinician, may be different from what's needed to, for example, to help with some of the other psychological symptoms as well. So in effect, you may not need the same doses that you. Another interesting thing about particularly flumazenil, again, one thing is that it's quite controversial, its use in intoxication. Simply because though it isn't freely available, the ideal patient for flumazenil is a naive patient who's used an overdose of benzodiazepines for the first time. In fact, in somebody with a chronic benzodiazepine dependence, the use of flumazenil is thought to increase chances of seizure and precipitate a severe withdrawal when used for intoxication. So, funnily enough, its use is a little bit controversial at the moment. We have a few questions. Dr. Faiza would like to know the dosage of pregabalin, baclofen, and quetiapine in benzodiazepine dependence.
Okay, coming to pregabalin, the study that I quoted used it from 225 to 600 mg. It was a highly variable dose. Coming to baclofen, that is the study which we have published from our center. We had used a dose from 50 to 80 mg. Coming to quetiapine, I think they had used low dose 50 to 75 mg was the dose which was used in that particular retrospective review which they presented.
Are there any cases of tofizopam dependence?
It's interesting, sir. Tofizopam is an atypical benzodiazepine. It probably does not affect alpha-1 receptors and has minimal addiction liability. My reservations about tofizopam is, again, the molecule was discovered in 1962. If it could not get popular till now, there has to be something wrong with it. I mean, probably it's not that good an anti-anxiety agent. We'll have to review the literature for that.
There's a few questions about carbamazepine and high dose dependence. Maybe we'll combine all of them and you can answer them one by one. Carbamazepine, melatonin, and combinations with beta blockers or antidepressants.
I put that odds ratio wala chart in which, yes, carbamazepine seems to have a good response when added to systematic discontinuation. I could not find good literature to say that a patient is taking high doses of diazepam. From tomorrow, you put him on 600 mg of carbamazepine and don't give him diazepam and it is going to work. I could not find any literature to support this line of treatment. But yes, adding carbamazepine is going to increase the chances of his remaining abstinent, is going to decrease the total period required for you to detox him. So that is about the carbamazepine. Melatonin numbers needed to treat in healthy individuals were 12, sir. And it's a very difficult drug to use. You have to swallow it and then you should not be exposed to light at all. Otherwise, the whole rhythm is lost. Remilation, on the other end, because of a longer half-life, perhaps could be more useful.
Beta blockers and antidepressants.
Beta blockers, the odds ratio confidence interval is crossing 0. And it makes, biologically, it makes sense. I mean, it might control. I mean, for all we know, propranolol actually has a very poor blood-brain barrier passage. What it does is it controls peripheral markers of anxiety, and going by the somatic marker hypothesis, the patient feels less anxious. But it is not going to work in this case in which there is a CNS hyperexcitation sort of a picture. You will need something to calm down the CNS person.
Antidepressants.
Antidepressants, yes, sir. We have reviewed it in that chart. they do increase the chances of success significantly.
I think Tezpur would like to know about the odds ratio of flumazenil. That is 3.7.
These are just two studies, sir. One in 1987 and one recently in 2014. And
I think for now then
1
I
to
think
14.
Because we have a lot of literature in this regard. So any possibility of pregabalin or gabapentin coming up as a harm reduction strategy, long-term maintenance, something we have buprenorphine for this opioid use or methadone for opioid use, something like that coming up.
I think nobody is daring to publish such thing. I mean, we should. But then, as of now, no existent literature on using pregabalin in a sort of agonist substitution. Although it does make sense. Gabapentin more so because it's a calcium channel blocker as well as increases GABA availability at the level of synapse. But as of now, literature does not support doing that.
Because as in my practice, I found that something might be useful for them, because this group, they are not able to, like as we saw in our case, like the last 10 or 15 mg of diazepam, it is very difficult to taper it off, and they go to other substance, they go to alcohol or some other harmful substance they may go to. So it would like.
There are probably two things that with pregabalin and gabapentin you must remember. One is that it's relatively so new that it's not reached in guidelines. Guidelines don't talk about it at all. So as a general method of recommendation, it's probably not something we recommend, but it's something that definitely is worth looking into. The second thing about pregabalin is that when somebody is using multiple depressant drugs, for example, alcohol or opioid, polysubstance user, that's where you have the problem. Though it's been used in opioid this thing as well. But if somebody does use an opioid plus pregabalin or alcohol plus pregabalin, the combined sedation is going to be quite high. So it needs to be used with caution.
There are studies on opioids, but not on benzodiazepines.